publication, 新加坡选择了李光耀, or Singapore chose Lee Kuan Yew. This Chinese publication, presented in 9 volumes, examines the various aspects of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew's career and personal life, based on several themes such as nation building, diplomacy, family and friendship, and personal health. Mr. Sing Han Tong, who was the speaker in our first panel this morning, led the project as the series editor, and it was written with several veteran Chinese journalists, and they put this together for launch today. So may I invite you to turn your attention now to the stage as I call upon our very special lunch guest today, Minister for Education, Mr. Heng Swee Kiat. He will talk about the publication, he will speak in English and then in Mandarin with similar content, and then launch the book with 3 other distinguished guests. So Minister Heng Swee Kiat, please.
Mr. Kishore Mahbubani, Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School, and distinguished guests, colleagues. Very good afternoon to all of you. It is a great pleasure to launch Singapore Chose Lee Kuan Yew, or in Mandarin, 新加坡选择了李光耀. This Chinese collection is the 3rd of a series. The first 2 collections, called The Papers of Lee Kuan Yew and comprising 20 volumes altogether, span his English language speeches, interviews, and dialogues from 1950 to 2011. The collection to be launched today is unique. It is a condensed selection of Mr. Lee's speeches, interviews, and dialogues, organized under 9 themes that offer close insights into his political career and personal life, as a good friend and colleague, a caring husband and father, and a far-sighted and resolute statesman, committed to Singapore's success. This collection also includes new material that cannot be found in earlier collections of Mr. Lee's papers. Mr. Lee's authentic voice comes through in this collection, whether it is in mobilizing Singaporeans to build a nation or his strategic grasp of global matters. It is a voice not of political correctness, but a voice of absolute conviction, and as I will share with you later, of utter devotion to a single purpose. He has, on more than one occasion, said he's not interested in being politically correct. He's interested in being correct. A collection of Mr. Lee's statements is at heart an attempt to capture the honesty, courage, and profound wisdom that underlie his every word. It is this voice that leads many leaders around the world to describe Mr. Lee as a true global statesman. More importantly, this collection is in Mandarin, making it accessible to the many readers here and abroad who will appreciate the chance to connect with Mr. Lee's ideas in this language. Mr. Lee himself is a consistent advocate of bilingualism, believing that it enables us to retain our cultural roots and help us see issues from a different perspective. Indeed, 2 years ago, Mr. Lee published his book, My Lifelong Challenge, on Singapore's bilingual journey, and set up the Lee Kuan Yew Fund for Bilingualism. Han Tong, who is the chief editor of this collection, told me something interesting about his experience working on this, and I quote, "It is this teamwork and our collective memory that the Singapore story is retold. We observed that each and every turn of events gives us more confidence that we are able to overcome any setback and surprise if we are united and prepared. Our dreams come true because of Mr. Lee's vision and pragmatism and strong support from the ground," unquote. Indeed, studying the way Mr. Lee approached the twists and turns in Singapore's early history gives us confidence that Singapore will be able to face future challenges if we maintain the same spirit of unity and preparedness. When I look backwards at Mr. Lee's achievements, I'm invariably pointed in the direction of the future. In particular, to do everything possible to be ready for it. There is an achievement in this collection that is not just about translating from English to Chinese. There is also a special bridging across generations that happens in the process. The story of our journey as a young nation will resonate with the generation who went through our early hardships with Mr. Lee. But the young will also benefit from learning our past, even as they seek to forge a better future. For this achievement, I'm grateful to those who made this collection a reality. I thank the National Archives of Singapore, the publisher Cengage, Han Tong and his team of editors, Mr. Chan Chin Jiang, Mr. Han Tan Juan, Mr. Teh Bon Hoi, and Mr. Goh Su Heng, who plowed through history and brought it to life. In doing so, you have opened for us an invaluable and evocative window into the life and work of Mr. Lee. Now please allow me to say a few words in Mandarin. 我们在李光耀先生90诞辰的今天，推介新加坡选择了李光耀这套丛书，意义特别重大。老一辈新加坡人和建国总理李光耀一起走过一段艰辛的道路，他们的情谊可以说是同甘共苦。新加坡选择了李光耀这套丛书，是我们的共同回忆。因为李光耀先生选择了他从政之路，因为新加坡人选择了李光耀，一位改变了新加坡人命运的人，我们才有今天繁荣发达的新加坡。李光耀先生以他的远见、他的魄力、他的坚持，带领了我们一起摆脱殖民地政府的统治，一起争取和平的斗争，一起建设家园，发展经济，克服重重困难和危机。老一辈新加坡人见证了一个小小的岛国，可以在一代人的时间里，从第三世界国家晋升到第一世界国家，这是梦想成真。这套丛书选入了他在新加坡独立之后，每一年在国庆群众大会上的演讲摘录，分析了每一项重大政策拟定的前因后果，反映了他在国际舞台上为新加坡扩大了活动空间，还有他如何动员建国，他的亲情和友情，他的养生之道。对于新加坡人来说，他的真知灼见，他的洞察先机，他的忧国忧民，构成了我们对他最深刻的印象。年轻一代在展望未来的同时，了解我们的过去所走过的不平凡的道路，借鉴其中所累积的宝贵经验，可以帮助我们如何取舍，如何做出明智的抉择。李光耀先生在36岁出任自治邦总理时，就凭着他不屈不挠的精神，他的理想，他的魄力，把新加坡带上成功之路。新加坡的未来将由年轻一代来继承，希望他们能够吸取这套丛书所蕴含的智慧，尤其是能效仿李光耀先生为国献身的精神，为新加坡开创一条康庄大道。谢谢大家。
Thank you, Minister. Now, may I invite Mr. Seng Han Tong, who is the series editor, and then Mrs. Elaine Ng, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the National Library Board representing the National Archives of Singapore, and the Dean to jointly launch this publication together by unveiling an image of the cover of the publication. not interested in being politically correct, but interested in being correct. This is a publication that seeks to bridge linguistic groups in their understanding of Lee Kuan Yew in his own words, bridging the generations so that what were founding ideas of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew can be translated onto the next generation. Now, as a token of appreciation, Mrs. Ng will present a set of the books to Minister Heng. And Mrs. Ng will also present another set of the books to the Dean. Once again, thank you, Mrs. Ng, Mr. Seng Han Tong, Minister Heng, and Dean. And now, as I invite the staff to place the chairs on the stage, just want to say congratulations again to National Archives, to Cengage for launching this book. Along with sort of flyers of this book, Straits Times Press has also set up a little booth outside to sell the other publications on Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. Those will be sold at a special discount just to participants today, so please make sure you avail yourself of that. Now over to Dean Kishore.
Thank you, Gillian. Now we come to the main event for the luncheon session. We are delighted that the Minister of Education, Minister Heng Swee Kiat, has agreed to give us an address. My job here is to be as brief as possible, and I may not do full justice to the Minister, but I'll make a very brief introduction of him. He was elected a Member of Parliament on 7th May 2011 and became Minister of Education also in May 2011. But he's had a remarkably varied career. Before that, he was Managing Director of the Monetary Authority of Singapore. And he did so well down there that in February 2011, Asia Pacific Central, he was named the Asia Pacific Central Banker of the Year by the British magazine, The Banker. Before that, he was Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Trade and Industry, and before that, the CEO of the TDB, and everywhere, as you know, he served with distinction. But particularly, he served with distinction as the Principal Private Secretary to Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. And those of you who read one of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew's recent books will have noticed that Mr. Lee mentioned that Mr. Heng was the best PPS he ever had. And that's a remarkable compliment when you consider the competition of the other PPS who were there. But this is not surprising. He's also had a wonderful background in his education too. He had an MA in economics from Cambridge University, and after that a master's in public administration from the Kennedy School of Government and Harvard University. So for us, a School of Public Policy, we take particular pleasure that the Minister of Education is a graduate of a sister School of Public Policy, the JFK School. So, Minister, over to you.
Well, thank you, Kishore, for your very kind remarks. I think you have discussed many great ideas earlier this morning and many more this afternoon. So what I'll do is I'll say a few words about my reflections on my time serving Mr. Lee as his PPS. The first time I met Mr. Lee Kuan Yew in person was in March 1997, when he interviewed me for the job of Principal Private Secretary or PPS. His questions were fast and sharp. Every reply drew even more probing questions. At the end of it, he said, "Brush up your Mandarin and report in 3 months. We have an important project with China." I realized later that, among others, it was perhaps when I replied, "I don't know," to one or two questions that I might have made an impression. With Mr. Lee, it is all right if you do not know something, but you do not pretend and lie if you do not know. Integrity is everything. I had the privilege of working as Mr. Lee's PPS from mid-1997 to early 2000. This was the period of the Asian financial crisis, and Mr. Lee was writing his memoirs. I benefited much interacting with him and attending his meetings with many prominent leaders, including many of in this room. I learned much about his worldview, about how he translates ideas into results, and what he is like as a person. Let me start with worldviews. Mr. Lee's worldviews are comprehensive and consistent. Three stand out for me. The first is about Singapore's place in the world. He has experienced wars and foreign domination, has sung 4 different national anthems in his lifetime, and has fought for Singapore's independence. Naturally, Mr. Lee's lifelong preoccupation is how Singapore, a resource-poor city-state, can survive in a world where powers big and small compete for supremacy. His view is that a small city-state can best survive in a benign world environment, where there is a balance of powers, where no single state dominates, and where order and rule of law prevails in international affairs. A small city-state has to stay open and connect with all nations and economic powerhouses. To prosper, Singapore has to be relevant to the world. We must be exceptional. Second, his views about human nature, culture, and society. Some societies are more successful than others because of the way they are organized and the values and cultures that underpin them. Human beings have 2 sides to our nature. One that is selfish, that seeks to compete and to maximize benefits for ourselves, our families, our clans. The other that is altruistic, that seeks to cooperate, to help others, and to contribute to the common good. A society loses its vigor if it eschews excellence and competition. Equally, a society loses its cohesion if it fails to take care of those who are left behind or disadvantaged. Mr. Lee believes that this tension between competition and cooperation, between yin and yang, is one that has to be constantly recalibrated. Within a society, those who are successful must contribute back to society and help others find success. We must share the fruits of our collective efforts. Third, his views about governance and leadership. Societies are subject to complex forces and do not become successful automatically. As a lawyer, Mr. Lee believes deeply in the rule of law and the importance of institutions in creating a good society. But institutions are only as good as the people who run them. Good governance needs leaders with the right values, sense of service, and abilities. It is important to have leaders who can forge with the people the vision for the future and to forge the way forward together. Above all, leaders are stewards. We should develop future leaders, and when their time comes, they should relinquish their positions so that the next generation of leaders can take us to greater heights. While Mr. Lee's worldviews are wide-ranging and widely sought, when I worked with him, I had the privilege of learning how his views are so coherent, rigorous, and fresh, and how he puts his agile mind in the service of the Singapore cause. Allow me to share a few incidents. Mr. Lee's favorite question is, so? If you update him on something, you invariably reply, so? You reply and you think you have answered him, but again he asks, so? Now this so question forces you to get to the core of the issue and draw out the implications of each fact. His instinct is to cut through the clutter, drill to the core of the issue, and identify the vital points. And he does this with an economy of effort. I learned this the hard way. Once, in response to a question, I wrote him 3 paragraphs. I thought I was comprehensive. Instead, he said, I only need a 1-sentence answer. Why did you give me 3 paragraphs? I worked very hard on that, and so I reflected long and hard on this, and realized that that was how he cut through the clutter. When he was a Prime Minister, there are so many issues that he had to grapple with. So it was critical to distinguish between the strategic and the peripheral issues. On my first overseas trip with Mr. Lee, just a few weeks after I started work, Mrs. Lee, ever so kind, must have sensed my nervousness. So she said to me, "My husband has strong views, but don't let that intimidate you." Indeed, Mr. Lee has strong views because these are rigorously derived, but he's also very open to robust exchange. Mr. Lee makes it a point to hear from those who can contribute to it, those with expertise and experience. He is persuasive, but he can be persuaded. A few months into my job, Mr. Lee decided on a particular course of action on the Suzhou Industrial Park after deep discussion with our senior officials. That evening, I realized that amid a flurry of information, we had not discussed a point which was relevant to our approach. I gingerly wrote him a note proposing some changes. To my surprise, he agreed. Mr. Lee's rich insights on issues come from a capacious and disciplined mind. He listens and reads widely, but he does so like a detective, looking for and linking vital clues while discarding the irrelevant. Once, he asked if I recalled an old newspaper article on US-China relations. Obviously, I could not. That was several months back, and I had put it out of my mind. But a fresh news article had triggered him to link the two developments. I realized then that he has a mental map of the world where he knows its contours well. Like a radar, he was constantly scanning for changes and matching this against the map. What might appear as random and disparate facts to many of us are placed within this map, and hence his mental map is constantly being refreshed. A senior US leader described this well. Mr. Lee is like a one-man intelligence agency. But the most remarkable feature of this map in Mr. Lee's head is the fact that the focal point is always Singapore. I mentioned his favorite word, so. Invariably, the so question ends with, so what does this mean for Singapore? What are the implications? What should we be doing differently? Now, nothing is too big or too small. I accompanied Mr. Lee on many overseas trips. The 1998 trip to the US, where Ambassador Chan Heng-chi was ambassador then, is particularly memorable. Each day brought new ideas, and throughout the trip, I sent back many observations for our departments, many observations for Mr. Lee, for our departments to study. It might be the type of industry that we might develop, or the type of trees that might add color to our garden city. And this remains very much his style today. His every waking moment is devoted to Singapore, and Mr. Lee wants Singapore to be successful beyond his term as Prime Minister. Remarkably, from the early 60s, he already spoke about finding his successor. During my term with him as Senior Minister, he devoted much of his effort to helping then PM Goh Chok Tong succeed. He refrained from visiting Indonesia or Malaysia as he wanted PM Goh to establish himself as our leader. Instead, he fanned out to China, US and Europe to convince leaders and investors that PM Goh's leadership would take Singapore onto new levels of success. As Senior Minister, he worked out with PM Goh the areas that he could contribute. And I will share 3 key projects which illustrate his contributions, but more importantly, how he develops insights and achieves results. Insights are valuable, but how does Mr. Lee turn insights into results? I believe it is through a single-minded focus on achieving whatever he sets out to do. The Suzhou Industrial Park was one of the areas in which PM Goh asked Mr. Lee to stay actively involved. 2 years into the project, we ran into teething problems. Local Chinese officials promoted their own rival park. Some felt that such startup problems and cultural differences were expected and would be resolved over time. But Mr. Lee drilled deep into the issues and held many meetings with our officials. He worked with an intensity I had not expected of someone who was then 75 years old. He concluded that the problem was much more fundamental. China had, and still has, a very complex system of government with many layers and many interest groups, some formal, some invisible. The interests of the various groups at the local levels were not aligned with the objectives that the central government in Beijing and Singapore had agreed upon. Unless this was put right, the project would not go far. Instead of hoping that time will resolve this, Mr. Lee raised issues at the highest levels and made the disagreements public. Mr. Lee was unfazed that going public would diminish his personal standing. And he did. I mean, there were many critical articles then in the press. Mr. Lee proposed to the Chinese, among others, two radical changes: to swap the shareholding structure so that the Chinese had majority control, and to appoint the CEO of the rival park to head the Suzhou Industrial Park. It was not a given that these changes would work, but Mr. Lee was proven right. The changes created the necessary realignment and put the project back on track. Next year, we'll be witnessing the 20th anniversary of Suzhou Industrial Park. From all accounts, Suzhou Industrial Park has been a success story, not just in its development, but in how it has enabled a new generation of leaders from both sides to develop a deeper understanding of each other and in paving the way for further collaboration. I learned a valuable lesson. If things go wrong, do not sweep them aside. Confront the problems, get to the roots of the difficulties, and wrestle with this resolutely. Go for long-term success and not be deterred by criticisms. My second example on the revamping of the financial sector shows how Mr. Lee is constantly looking out for how Singapore should change and how Mr. Lee turns adversity into opportunity. The 1997-98 Asian financial crisis hit the region hard. Many analysts attribute it to cronyism, corruption, and nepotism. Mr. Lee read up on all the technical analysis and met with our economists. I was amazed at the age of 75 how deeply he delved into the issues, including the very technical ones. He concluded that the reason was more basic. Investors' euphoria and the weak banking and regulatory systems in the affected countries had allowed a huge influx of short-term capital. These weaknesses had their origins in the political system. Cronyism exacerbated the problems, but that was not the cause. Years later, many bankers have told me that Mr. Lee's analysis then was the best they had heard. Mr. Lee was convinced that though Asia's economic growth would be set back temporarily, dynamism would return. In the short term, we had to navigate the crisis carefully, but for the longer term, we should turn this adversity into opportunities. While investors fled, we should use the crisis to lay the foundation for a stronger Singapore in a rising Asia. Mr. Lee took the opportunity to review the long-term positioning of the Singapore financial sector. With the permission of the then PM Goh Chok Tong, he met experts from different backgrounds and met with the chairman of local banks. For years, Mr. Lee believed in strict regulation and in protecting our local banks. While this protected our banks from the crisis, it had its cost. Our stringent rules, while appropriate in the past, were now stifling growth and our banks were falling behind. Mr. Lee was persuaded to change his long-held views and that our regulatory stance had to change. I was struck by Mr. Lee's systematic and calibrated approach to changing a complex financial system. Mr. Lee's reputation is that he's impatient for results and drives a fast pace. This is true, but he is also wise in distinguishing between things that change only slowly and things that ought to change swiftly. Instead of one big bang, he was in favor of a series of steps which added up to a significant shift in direction. Mr. Lee discussed with and sought PM Goh's approval on a broad plan to revamp the financial sector. PM Goh agreed with the plan and later appointed then DPM Lee Hsien Loong as the chairman of MAS in January 1998. The then DPM, who has a very strategic grasp of issues and meticulous attention to details, did a review of major policies and reorientated MAS's organization culture. Remarkably, within a few years, MAS was transformed. By 2006, when I became MD of MAS, or 2005, I inherited an organization with a new set of regulatory doctrines and a deeper pool of talent. The global financial crisis of 2007-2008 tested our system severely. We not only withstood the shock, we emerged stronger after the crisis. Singaporeans' savings were well protected and businesses recovered rapidly. If Mr. Lee had not initiated the changes in the late 1990s and sought to turn adversity into opportunities, we would not have become a stronger financial center today. To prepare ourselves to opening up our financial center in the midst of one of the worst financial crises is to me an act of great foresight and boldness. It has the stamp of Mr. Lee. My third example relates to how Mr. Lee expanded our external space by being a principled advocate of collaboration based on long-term interest. Today, we are remarkably well connected, but this did not come by accident. Over the years, Mr. Lee has worked hard at this. His strategic worldview has projected Singapore onto the global stage and created opportunities for Singaporeans. In all his years as the face of Singapore, Mr. Lee has also made fast friendships with senior world leaders who appreciate his view of things and respect Singapore's principled stance on international issues. In PM Go's time and today, Mr. Lee remains a steady, respected voice in the international arena. This was driven home to me at two meetings that left a deep impression on me. In 1999, relations between the US and China were very tense. China's negotiations with the US on its entry to the WTO had failed. There were tensions between the US and China over US bombs that had hit the Chinese embassy in Belgrade, and President Lee Teng-hui in Taiwan had pronounced his two-states concept. In July 1999, US Secretary of State Madeleine Albright and Chinese Foreign Minister Tang Jiaxuan were in Singapore for the ASEAN Regional Forum. It was quite tense, and many of our officials believed there could be a flare-up at the ARF. Both figures met Mr. Lee separately. Mr. Lee gave each side his reading of their long-term strategic interest. His advice to the US was that it was not in their interest to be adversarial towards China or regard her as a potential enemy. To China, he suggested that she should tap into the market, technology, and capital of the US to develop her economy. They should look forward and search for areas of cooperation, such as China's entry into the WTO. Sitting in these meetings, I was struck by how Mr. Lee approached the delicate situation. He did not say one thing to another and sing a different tune to the other. If they had compared notes later, they would have found his underlying position consistent. What made him persuasive was how he addressed the concerns and interests of each side. I could see from the way both reacted that his argument struck a chord, and one of the guests asked a note-taker to write the notes verbatim for deeper study later on. In 2000, when I was at the MTI, a few months after this meeting, I was very pleased to witness China's entry into the WTO at the Doha meeting. Let me now say a few words about Mr. Lee as a person. What is he like as a person? The public persona of Mr. Lee is a strict, stern, no-nonsense leader. But deep down, he's energized by a deep sense of care for Singaporeans, especially the disadvantaged. He does not express this in soft, sentimental terms. His policies speak louder, and he's content to let them speak for themselves. He distributed the fruits of Singapore's early progress in a very significant way by enabling Singaporeans to own their flats. Apart from the investment in education, he personally donated generously to the education fund to provide awards, especially to outstanding students from poor families. And today, many students still benefit from this. He is a firm advocate of a fair and just society, but he demands that everyone, including those who are helped, put in their fair share of efforts. Many regard Mr. Lee as a pragmatist who does not hesitate to speak the hard truths. Actually, I think he's also an idealist with a deep sense of purpose. He believes one has to see the world as it is, not as one wishes it to be. Fate deals us with a certain hand of cards, but it is up to us to make a winning hand of it. Through sheer will, conviction, and imagination, there's always hope of progress. Man is not perfect, but can be better. Mr. Lee embraces Confucianism because of his belief in the perfectibility of man. No society is perfect either, but a society with a sense of togetherness can draw out the best of our human spirit and create a better future for our people. He is, to me, a pragmatic idealist. During my term as PPS, the Prime Minister of a Pacific Island nation asked to call on Mr. Lee. Given Mr. Lee's very tight schedule, I thought Mr. Lee would not be able to meet him. To my surprise, Mr. Lee said he will make the time. He explained that this young Prime Minister's father had been a comrade in arms, fighting the British for independence, and he owed it to his father, who had passed on, to offer whatever advice might be helpful. Mr. Lee and his family are closely knit, and he was particularly close to Mrs. Lee. On overseas trip, I had the opportunity to have many private meals with Mr. and Mrs. Lee. It was heartwarming to see their bantering. Mr. Lee has a sweet tooth, and Mrs. Lee will, with good humor, keep score of the week's ration. But when it came to official work, they draw very clear lines. Mrs. Lee stayed close by Mr. Lee's side and traveled with him whenever she could. Once in Davos, Mrs. Lee came into the tiny room where Mr. Lee was giving a media interview. She found a stool at the corner and sat there, listening unobtrusively. Twice, I offered her my more comfortable seat near Mr. Lee. She said to me, "You have work to do. I'm just a busybody. Don't let me disturb you." Mrs. Lee was supportive without intruding. She was certainly not just a busybody, and anyone who had a chance to observe them together would know just how close a couple they were and how much strength her presence gave to her husband. We live today in a different world that demands of us new ideas and approaches. But there is one quality of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew that we can and need to aspire towards. Mr. Lee's unwavering and total dedication to Singapore, to keeping Singapore successful so that Singaporeans may determine our own destiny and lead meaningful, fulfilling lives. Singapore's survival and success are Mr. Lee's life work and his lifelong preoccupation. History gave him a most daunting challenge, building a nation out of a tiny city-state with no resources and composed of disparate migrants. He cast aside his doubts, mustered all his being, and has given it his all. Mr. Lee's most significant achievement is to show the way forward in building a nation. There were, and still are, no textbook answers for achieving this. Mr. Lee and his team analyzed the issues from first principles and had the courage and conviction to do what was right and what would work for Singapore. Mr. Lee is an activist. He and his team would try, adapt, and experiment to get on with the job of making Singapore a better home for all. In the same way that he asked himself, we need to always be asking ourselves, so what does this mean for Singapore? So what should we do about it and act on it? Of the many qualities I've observed in Mr. Lee, this is the one that leaves the deepest impression on me, the one that I hope we can all learn to have. We take inspiration from the courage and determination of Mr. Lee and his colleagues. The task of creating a better life for all Singaporeans through expanding opportunities and through building a fair and just society never ends. Mr. Lee is not just a man of ideas, he's a man of action. I hope that this conference not only enable us to discuss the big ideas of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, I hope it also stirs us to action, and to do so with the same unwavering dedication to Singapore and to our future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The Minister actually has to go to Parliament, but he's kindly agreed to take one or two questions. I'll pose the first question, then maybe one or two of you may ask the question. My first question is a very obvious one because you mentioned it several times. So, actually my question was, how, if Mr. Lee was here, and as you know, he was perpetually obsessed about the future of Singapore and obsessed about the new challenges that were coming. If he were here today, if you had to make a guess on what his worries are about the future of Singapore, what would you cite as some of the worries he might have?
Well, I think Kishore, Mr. Lee has put it very clearly in his latest book, One Man's View of the World, that his biggest worry about Singapore is our population. And at the same time, I think he has also indicated that essentially it is the whole framework of governance of Singapore and how united Singaporeans can remain. No idea is good for all times, and not every idea will be applicable, but there are certain aspects of Singapore's circumstances which we all do well to fully understand, and so that we can isolate the critical things that we need to do to make Singapore successful into the future. And I think there are quite a number of these, including how we have to ensure that our institutions and our leadership is free from corruption, how we have to continue to have this sense of unity and resilience among our people, and how we must continue to be able to adapt and change as the world changes.
Great. Does anyone have a question from the floor? I don't see any hand. Yes, I see a hand there. Please, can you come to the microphone, please, and pose a question? I think it's Asad, right? Yes. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Minister, thank you very much for that wonderful, illuminating and penetrating speech that you made. It's a small little thing that I came across once. Mr. Lee was asked, what is your legacy to Singapore? And his answer was, Singapore. And I think all that we've been discussing today is about this Singapore. Now, you touched on one challenge in response to the Dean's question, the population challenge. But going more fundamentally into what makes us a people, Minister, what would you consider just three things that could destroy this legacy of Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, this Singapore? And I say destroy the fundamentals of this place. Apart from, population, yes, you're looking at it. What are three key fundamental challenges, problems, issues?
What could destroy the legacy of Mr. Lee?
Yeah.
Destroy Singapore, which is the legacy of...
You're asking for my personal view?
Yes,
or?
I am.
Okay. Well, I think Mr. Lee's observation that for Singapore to survive and prosper, we cannot be just any ordinary country, because we have to, in a sense, stay ahead and stay relevant to the world. And then the next question is, how do you stay relevant and stay ahead? How do you remain special to ourselves, special to the world? And I would say that there are a couple of things that are critical. One, of course, is, what kind of people are we? What sort of, as Singaporeans, what are the character and values of Singaporeans? What are the ways in which we relate to each other? Do we have that sense of togetherness? If we do, and that we can agree on what is it that we should be pursuing together, I believe we can remain successful in navigating the changes. And this requires a certain degree of honesty among ourselves. I think one of Mr. Lee's most and important quality is his honesty. He is very honest about his views. He sees issues as it is, and then he speaks his mind. And as I mentioned in the Suzhou experience, he doesn't duck the difficult issues. He confronts them and says, look, these are the challenges. And I think as Singaporeans, if we are able to do so and say, look, these are some of the challenges that we face, and if we're able to work it out together, I believe we can continue to be successful. So that is one. And two, the quality of our institutions and leadership. If you look around the world, and I had personal experience of it during the global financial crisis, when we have governance structure that does not quite meet the needs and challenges of building a society for the long term, then I think it is going to be very difficult. The most obvious, of course, will be corruption, and I think if you have corruption, we will be in deep trouble, and Singapore will go down very, very quickly. Yeah. And I think if we are able to do that well, that there's a certain Singaporean character that is resilient, that's united, that's adaptable, then as a society we can overcome many challenges together.
You haven't given the third one though.
Yeah.
You mentioned two, people and institutions.
Well, I think the third one is implicit in my first and two, which is the need to continually adapt and change. Because how do you stay relevant if you do not continue to adapt and change? And in this room, there are many CEOs, many diplomats, many academics, and you know that if you look at the evolution of ideas, there isn't a single idea that there are important ideas that have enduring value. There are also ideas which were faddish and which didn't quite meet the needs of the time. And how do we take those ideas and look at our circumstances thoroughly? One of Mr. Lee's very important qualities is that he does not go by fad and fashion, and nor does he accept that what works in one place will work in another. I mean, he is very much an empiricist. He looks at whether it has worked elsewhere or whether it has not. And in the same way, if you look at many of our discussions, I find that very often we say, well, something is being done in this place, why can't we do it in Singapore? And I would urge that we look at some of these issues from first principles, look at what are the challenges that we face, what are the resources we have, what are the constraints we have, and then work out the solutions on our own in our own unique way. I don't think there is one formula that we can just blindly import from anywhere else. And so this ability to adapt and change in a way that is relevant to Singapore, in a way that is applicable to Singapore, and having that courage to defy conventional wisdom or to defy what the world thinks is the solution, I think that will make us special and exceptional.
Thank you.
Okay, maybe one quick question from there, and then we're going to try and finish. Please go ahead. We're running slightly behind time, but we'll quickly take one question.
Thank you, Minister, for your speech.
Thank you.
I'd just like to ask, on behalf of the students from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, how you plan to cultivate the next big idea for Singapore, and what is your idea to cultivate the next Mr. Lee Kuan Yew for Singapore?
I think Mr. Lee Kuan Yew is a very unique individual. I'm not sure we can, clone another Mr. Lee. Everyone is unique. What I do hope is that as the Minister for Education, that we can provide, for a first-class education system for every Singaporean. And I think in the process, a younger generation will learn and will emerge. What I do hope is that the younger generation make the efforts to understand our history and make the efforts to understand our circumstances. And if they do, and if they are equipped with this ability to make sense of the world, and if they have the courage to do what is right for Singapore, I think we will throw up many good leaders in the future, not just in the political arena, but in every sector of our society.
So I think on that very optimistic note, please join me in thanking Minister for taking time out of his busy schedule.
a one-man intelligence agency, the pragmatic idealist who confronts reality and translates them into strategies in order to achieve the ideals. I'm sure you'll agree with me that Mr. Heng has made this a meal to remember by sharing his insights with working with Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. Please join me in giving him another round, a hearty round of applause, please.